Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about vibe coding and whether or not developers really need to even be doing it or not. Vibe coding is this kind of trend that's caught a huge wave. Tell an AI like what you want to build. You could use your voice. And then what you're going to do is you're going to review the outcome of what the AI builds for you without actually looking at the code. And then you're going to use that to tell the system, I actually want you to make these changes, or you're going to be telling it how you want it to iterate on that solution. So that's essentially what vibe coding is. The most famous examples of this is, of course, flypeter.com, which is this flight simulator / marketing website that sells a lot of ads. The author had no previous game dev experience. And while it is pretty impressive that it has been built with Three.js and some really cool tools here, he's still kind of struggling on the implementation, and like improving it is a mess. So like he's been kind of told, hey, instancing would be really good, reduce how many models exist and be able to kind of instance them instead, and that'll save some compute processing. But one, not an expert in game dev, so it's hard for him to like understand what do I do in those situations. And then two, it's also like a mess of code, right? And so he has to spend some time like breaking it down to get to the point where he can figure out how to make those changes. There are some benefits of adopting this approach in that you can go from zero to something very, very quickly. But there's also like this downside of being completely out of your depth at times. Where's that balance? Is this something that coders should adopt? And that's what we're going to be exploring a little bit today. So as I started thinking about this, one thing that I think of when I think about vibe coding is really capturing inspiration. Vibe coding is amazing at getting you from having an idea to building something that realizes that idea. And that's really interesting and powerful. One thing that I think of a lot is I'll be inspired to do something, but if I sit on that inspiration long enough, I won't really ever come back to it. You need to strike when the metal's hot in order to really like capture that kind of core essence. The downside of like trying to capture this inspiration is it's really great for being able to prototype something very, very quickly, create your boilerplate, get you started, get you going in a good direction. But there's some like hidden kind of challenges that you really actually need to figure out how to navigate as you vibe code. And so if you've used, AI coding tools or AI interfaces, there's a lot of challenge kind of baked in. I have a video where I let windsurf take the wheel and I tried to give it a direction to go in of what I wanted. Even with some technical prompting, it really struggled to craft a code base that really worked for me. This experience, though, as a developer, looking at the code and understanding what it's doing, that helps you kind of navigate reality, right? It's really easy for you to go in the direction that you kind of are thinking about and hit dead ends and hit walls and obstacles that block you from progress. And really it's only like the lessons that you've kind of learned along the way that like help you get to the end, right? And so if you're vibe coding, you're spending a lot of time like debugging this like unfamiliar code, and you're kind of you may end up even in like one of these dead ends that you've never been before. And so you're like, oh, I actually didn't know this was even a space we could go in. I guess it does go toward the end, but maybe I'm using a library I didn't know about, or the coding patterns here are really strange. And so you spend a lot of time like reviewing and debugging. And like, as you try and actually take those solutions to get to production, things get even trickier. So like you take this working solution, like you've successfully navigated and realized your dream, but now I want to release it to real people, to real users to like kind of play with and test. And getting there is hard because now you've got this working solution and now you need to like attach all of these different components, right? You need data integrity that actually allows people to save things successfully, not lose data, not overwrite data. You need your system to have some resiliency. That sort of testing and understanding is not something that necessarily gets baked into the solution right away. And then additionally, you need to think about like security and privacy and like how open and accessible are your tools that you're using, because AI doesn't necessarily know in what context the code is written. And so sometimes it'll expose things or leave things open. This process of vibe coding something that you were inspired to do and then getting it into production is now this kind of like tricky funnel. And like teams that are working in production are spending like, 1 to 2 days per sprint refactoring this code. We were talking with a team like this week. They'll use AI assistants to code some of their solutions, but because they're producing code so quickly, they have to spend extra time refactoring. And this is like Silicon Valley based, like startup company. They're kind of at the edge. They understand like what these tools can do, but they're still finding that like they have to do these two ends of things, right? Otherwise, they're never going to get to production. And so when we think about bringing AI in to be a coder, right, we're really talking about like changing our role here. If I am, a dev using an AI coding solution, that changes my role and like the activities that I'm actually doing from deving, from coding to being like a dev manager or a QA. If I'm like having that AI code for me, that's the role that now I have to kind of fit into more, right? It's not just about me producing, it's about me overseeing the production of something, right? And this AI is sort of that producer. Now imagine you're a designer and you're now overseeing this sort of AI designer that's kind of building out web pages for you or building out designs for different things. Now your role has now switched to being sort of a creative director, to giving it the right inspiration, to giving it the right direction, honing in on where you want it to go. You're now no longer doing the design work. Your job shifts. And maybe one of the more obvious ones that is kind of like the most relatable to people is like the writer one, right? If I'm a writer and I'm using AI and I start offloading some of the writing to the AI, now I become an editor or a publisher. The work that I'm doing isn't about crafting the words. It's now about how do I, shape the words that are created and ensure that there's like quality there and that those words like meet the needs of like the people. You're quality controlling what gets produced. You're no longer being the producer of it. Something to keep in mind is like, how good are you actually going to be at these jobs, right? Not only that, if you had to think about all the good managers that you've had, how common are the good traits that those managers have had as well? Management is a difficult task. Say you're a designer and I want to code or I want to write, right? Maybe there is like a benefit to leveraging AI for these sorts of things, right? But the challenge is really like, what do you have to do to be good at any of these roles? Say you're a designer and we take this designer example. I'm a designer. I'm working, really hard on like the design stuff. And I don't really want to offload my work to an AI, but I do have like dev needs and I have like copy needs. So I'm going to maybe push out in those categories and I'm going to leverage AI to help me kind of fill those gaps that I have. Now, what do I need to do to kind of fill in this kind of designer space, this dev QA space, dev manager space, and this sort of editor space? Like, right now I have this kind of like these three areas that I need to now focus on, right? So like if we just take the dev QA one, right, and we break it down into like what would make you effective at being a dev manager, there's a lot of different segments. There's like the technical understanding, right? Like, do you know how to like set up the environment for the code so that it's easy for the code to detect issues as issues come up? Are you creating things in isolation or do they need to have integration like with other systems? You also need to shield your team in case your AI mostly from distractions, right? You need to provide it with the correct context. You need to ensure that like the tasks that it works on are like really clear and understandable. And then like you need to establish like reusable practices too, right? Because now you're kind of in charge of like your team's workflows and patterns and things like that. So now you're working on like templates, patterns, your workflow definitions, your tool integrations, like all of this stuff now becomes like also some of your work as well, right? This well-organized planning and thinking also becomes really important, right? Like not only are you, ensuring that the AI only gets the context that it needs to work on the job that it's working on, but you also need to make sure that like the overall plan of what it builds makes sense, right? And then it builds things in the right order in order for you to be able to like organize how the work is done. And then you may need domain experience too. You may need to understand like what kind of errors could occur, any implementation details that are unique to that domain that might really matter. And then additionally, with APIs, you may actually need to be on the correct version, in which case like some of the AI issues where like the AI is out of date because they have this kind of like limited memory window could occur. And then additionally, you just need like clear communication. You need to be able to provide critical feedback to the AI on like, when things happen, what things need to be done, right? And so like there are these there are 6 qualities of a manager that are all somewhat difficult to accomplish, right? And so when we were saying like, hey, I can probably cover all of these different roles with just who I am and just the work that I'm doing, that's a pretty tall order. It's not necessarily that like you can't leverage AI for some of these tasks. It's that when you do, your role changes. You change from the activity that you were doing here to a new activity here. And as you change, you need to understand how to grow into that space, right? So I had this like job change at some point where I moved from being a developer to being a strategist. And the type of activities that I did changed really dramatically. So I was working on like, coding, solutions, debugging, and reverse engineering. I would be like, playing with APIs, understanding things like the way a coder could. And then when I started becoming a strategist, I stopped doing all those things and I started, reading docs. I started looking at the news, reading prospectuses, and I had no skill or training in being able to do these things. And so this transition actually made me go from like a strong place to actually like a pretty weak place, because now I was transitioning fully into this new role and trying to act the way that everybody else around me acted, even though I had this background that already existed. So what I needed to do instead was transition into being a dev strategist. And that transition would be significantly easier for me as I started like learning. So this was the wrong path completely. I actually needed to transition into being a dev strategist. In which case, you still do some of these activities. You actually still mostly do the dev activities, but in addition to that, then you try to like, understand the news and prospectuses, but you don't do that as a primary thing, right? You do that as like a secondary thing. The primary way that you understand how a business works or how a solution works is you understand the code, right? That's the place that I have strength in. But then when I transitioned into this role, I now have these other things that I need to think about. I need to have these other things that I have to contribute to, but I'm going to take the strengths that I have and apply that to these roles too. And so when we talk about this transition to a dev using AI coding to become like a dev manager, this is the full vibe code. That's exactly what you become, right? You become this sort of vibe code manager here. Now, there's two types of managers that you could be, right? You could be an informed manager, or you could be an uninformed manager. And I think these two paths are pretty common. A lot of people know what it feels like to work with these two different types of managers. The informed manager has realistic expectations. They have knowledge of the solution. They are informative and helpful. And so this just tends to be kind of like a good manager, right? An uninformed manager has like unrealistic expectations. They also rely on bad or partial information. They tend to be poor communicators because they lack the information of what they're trying to solve. If you're a dev transitioning to this space and go full vibe code, like you can still fit either of those two things, but I think it's significantly better if you also become a dev advisor. You are using an AI coder, right? But now like the kind of activities that you're doing are coming up with like dev plans, right? Like how are we going to like build this tool, right? You're like building docs with AI, defining plans to implement, reviewing code, contributing changes. You are now more involved. Like you're not just a manager, you're not out of the code completely, even if you maybe are informed. Instead, like if you're a dev advisor, really like that's where you can actually leverage your strengths. So I think that's a really important role change, is don't go from a place that you're like strong to a place that you're really weak. Go from a place where you're strong to a place where you're strong and you can build on what you're weak, right? That's really like when I think about vibe coding, that's really where a lot of this stuff comes into play. I found that taking these approaches to thinking about your role and the work that you're doing has been like really beneficial. We're launching a workshop around AI skills for designers. This whole workshop is really focused on being able to introduce AI into a designer's workflow without it becoming a replacement and putting them into a weak space, building strong capabilities and techniques that are really going to help a designer improve the work that they're already doing. We're not talking about completely offloading the work that they're doing to an AI. We're talking about instead really leaning into what they're already great at. If this sounds interesting, I'll drop a link in the description, but this is just something I've been working on. It relates to this topic, and it's been really fun to talk through this with teams to just kind of understand where they're coming from, because I think this is something that everyone's questioning now that we can create code with AI. What does that mean for our work? What does that mean for the kinds of tools that we need to leverage and how we operate? And I think at the end of the day, when you're talking about these different challenges, you need to be really aware of what that new role means. If you step into this new way of working, what are now all the new skills that you need to really have in order to be effective leveraging these tools, right? There's definitely this new space forming where you need to be able to get great stuff done, but also leverage these tools. If that's interesting, please reach out. As always, thanks a lot. We'd love it if you subscribe and like. It always helps us out here, just so we know we're connecting with people and what we're talking about is resonating. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to Stable Discussion. This is also the blog where we'll post a lot of the different content that we create. Hint.services is where we're hosting the different workshops and things that we're doing as well. If that's interesting to you or potentially interesting to your company, please reach out. I'd love to talk to you. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next one.